This video is on cells, the basic unit of life, and cell theory. In our ecology unit, we talked about the organization of life, but we started with organism and moved from there to population and then community. But we're going to backtrack and start with cells. Cells are the smallest unit of living things. You can't get smaller than a cell and be considered alive. They're the simplest thing that can carry on all six of those characteristics of life that we talked about with our ecology unit. They can reproduce, they can grow and develop, they can sense or respond to change, they can use energy, they can have DNA, and of course they're made of cells. Um, for some organisms, they are made of multiple cells, and so they have many cells that work together, and that's called a tissue. It's a group of cells that work together to do a specific job in the organism. Examples of some tissues that you have are red blood cells, muscles, fat. Those are some of the ones that you have in your body. When tissues work together, we call that an organ. And so examples of that are your stomach, your intestines, your heart, your lungs, your skin. So like your heart is many muscle tissues, those muscle cells working together in order to pump that blood around your body. An organ system is when multiple organs are working together to perform specific jobs. And sometimes it's also just called a system instead of just organ system. Examples of that are your digestive system and your nervous system, your circulatory system. There's lots of those. And then an organism is anything that can live on its own. There are two different types of organisms. There's unicellular organisms and there's multicellular organisms. A unicellular organism is when there's just one cell and that's it. And so those organisms don't have tissues and organ systems. And then there's multicellular organisms. They're made of many cells, and that's what you and I are. We have many, many, many cells in our body, and they work together to form tissues and organ systems, which altogether forms us into an organism. This is a picture of what the first person who looked at cells under a microscope saw. And these are cork cells, and they're dead, so all that he could see was the outside edge of the cell. And that person who did that was named Robert Hooke, and he called what he was seeing through his microscope cells, or little rooms. From there, lots of different people also helped us give us the information we need today about cells. The next person that was major in history was Anton van Leeuwenhoek. And one of the special things that he did was he added a second lens to the microscope. And so that gave us what we call the compound microscope. And that's the type of microscope that we use in class today, even, with a few adjustments. And he was the first person to look at live cells. He looked at pond scum and he saw these little things moving around in them. And so he called the creatures animalcules, which means little animals. Another important person in cell theory and the history of cells and what we know today is Matthias Schleiden. And he concluded that plant parts are made of cells by looking at tons of different plants and seeing that they all had these little rooms like Robert Hooke described. From there we get into Virchow and Schwann, and they developed cell theory. And cell theory is basically three simple statements that combine a whole bunch of different people's research and kind of summarizes it for us into three simple statements. And so the first one of cell theory is that all organisms are composed of one or more cells. You can't be an organism without being made of cells. The second one is that the cell is the most basic unit of life in all living things. You can't be simpler than a cell and not be alive. And then the third one is that all cells come from existing cells. And later on in our unit, we'll talk about what are some of the different processes that cells have for reproducing. There are many, many different types of cells, but there are certain things that all cells have in common. And those are that they have a cell membrane, that's a covering that goes around the outside of the cell. They have a copy of hereditary material that they got from the cell that they came from. And we call that DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. They also have cytoplasm, which is a fluid inside the cell. And then lastly, they are usually too small to be seen with just your eyes. There is an exception to that, but for the most part, cells are tiny. And so why are cells so tiny? Well, the reason is to increase the amount of area that they can use to interact with their environment. The surface area to volume ratio decreases when size increases. And cells want to have a high ratio for this. They want to be able to have lots of space to get stuff into the cell. But the bigger they are, the volume, when that increases, they need more stuff. So it's best for them to have a high ratio of surface area to volume. And you can see that illustrated in this picture. In the first picture right here, you can see that it's a really small cube. Each side equals 1. And so the total surface area, the height times width times number of sides, is 6. And the volume is 1. So our surface to volume ratio is 6. Now, if you increase that size of the cube by 5, you would get a total surface area of 150. And the total volume inside, the height times width times length, is 125. And so that gives us a surface to volume ratio of 1.2. So it's a lot lower. There's a lot less space on the edge to get stuff into the cell compared to the space inside of the cell. And that's not good because if the cell's big, it's going to need a lot of stuff. So the solution to that is being multicellular, like you can see in the third picture. That one is the same size as the big box, but instead it's made up of a whole bunch of little boxes, like the first picture. And that's what multicellular organisms do. They can grow by just adding more cells rather than making the cells get bigger, and that keeps them having a low surface to volume ratio without having to sacrifice size. So some other differences between multicellular organisms and unicellular organisms is that multicellular organisms can do more because they have different kinds of cells. They can be specialized to perform different functions, whereas with a unicellular organism, that one cell has to be able to carry on all 6 of those characteristics of life. If anything happens to that one cell, the organism's dead. With a multicellular organism, new cells can be created to reproduce and to replace the cells that are weaker in the organism. There are 2 major groups of cells. There's prokaryotic cells and there's eukaryotic cells. And you need to fill in the word eukaryotic on your chart. And then also put in all this information on your chart. Let's talk about prokaryotic cells first. Prokaryotic cells are also called bacteria, and they have no nucleus. That's the control center for the cell. It's kind of like the brain of the cell. And they also have less DNA, less hereditary material. The shape of the DNA in a prokaryotic cell is one long circle or loop. They have circular DNA. They also don't have any membrane-covered organelles. Now, if you remember from our characteristics of cells, all cells have organelles, but they don't have ones that are covered with a membrane. So they have some, but not a whole lot. They're also the world's smallest cells. Bacteria are incredibly, incredibly tiny. So that's prokaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells are the kind of cells that you have. You have eukaryotic cells. These are all living things that are not bacteria. So all plants and animals are eukaryotic. They have a nucleus, which is a membrane-covered structure that holds in the DNA. It acts like the control center for the cell. They also have more DNA, and their DNA is linear or in a line. They have membrane-covered organelles, and they're larger. So those are the major differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. You need to make sure that you write all of these down on your chart. You're going to need to know these differences for future exams. All right, and that concludes our study of cell theory and an introduction to cells.